So this last session for our day is on tenant protections, and it's conversations with the Biden-Harris administration. Most of you know that on January 25th, 2023, the Biden-Harris administration released a blueprint for a renter bill of rights, which articulates key principles of resident-centered housing provision. These principles include safe, quality, accessible, and affordable housing, clear and fair leases, education enforcement and enhancement of renter rights, the right to organize, eviction prevention, diversion, and relief. In addition to releasing this blueprint document, the administration released several new actions that agencies will take to strengthen tenant protections and avoid unnecessary evictions, and launched a resident-centered housing challenge to encourage Congress, state, local, and tribal policymakers and private housing actors to enhance or adopt policies and practices that promote fairness and transparency in the rental market. We're going to hear directly from administration officials this evening on what you can expect from the White House and the agencies charged with implementing the strategies outlined in the blueprint for a renter bill of rights. This is your opportunity. Let me say that again. This is your opportunity to let the administration know what else must be done. We've got two great speakers this evening who will join us. Vincent Reyna, who is Senior Policy Advisor for Housing and Urban Policy, White House Domestic Policy Council, and Mr. Cheng Chu, Senior Policy Advisor, Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at HUD. Please join me in welcoming Vincent Reyna and Cheng Chu.
Thank you so much. Should I start us off here? Cool. Nice to see you all. Nice to see a lot of familiar faces, both in person and on the screen. Hi, Laura. How are you? Really wonderful to be here with you all today and excited to hear your thoughts. So I'm going to present some kind of overarching comments on our blueprint for a renter's bill of rights, and then turn over to my colleague here, and then love to hear your thoughts and feedback. So first, I want to, of course, thank you for having me here today. This is a great company to be in, and look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. Want to talk a little bit about our blueprint for Renters' Bill of Rights because we're particularly excited about this work. To put this in context, we announced or released the blueprint about a week after our new Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, which we hope you all checked out, provided comments on. Very eager to see those. This aligns with our federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. This is informed and aligned with our Housing Supply Action Plan. And it's aligned with a lot of the things we've learned through the pandemic and the American Recovery Plan Act and the implementation of that, right? And while we have a lot of actions that we announced through the blueprint itself and things we're doing on an ongoing basis, we know firsthand that there's an important role for Congress to play in all of this conversation, and quite a critical role, not the least of which is passing the president's budget, right? So I hope you all were able to check out the budget, which was just released less than a couple weeks ago. The president recently announced the budget. It includes historic investments across a whole set of housing areas. In fact, there's a total of about $175 billion towards housing in very many new and exciting ways. Expanding housing supply, particularly affordable housing supply for extremely low-income households. We are the first to propose a guaranteed voucher for all extremely low-income veterans and youth aging out of foster care to contribute to our goals of reducing homelessness by 25%. We look at housing supply broadly. We bolster fair housing, increase access to home ownership. So a whole lot of great things in there that we feel like align with a lot of the ideas in the room and that you'll be hearing over the next couple days, and are excited to hear your feedback on as well. But as I said, in order for us to really advance renter protections and address the core issues of housing affordability, we need the budget to be passed, and we need these stronger set of protections to be codified in law, and the necessary supports to exist for renters, right? So with that said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through a little bit more of the blueprint for the Renter Bill of Rights. So first, to kind of give you a little insight. While we're all working inside of the White House, we're not doing it in silos. Throughout the process of creating the blueprint, we engaged many of you actually here in the room today, and we're tremendously grateful for it. We ran through an interagency policy process within the White House that worked with all of our federal agencies in unprecedented ways to essentially look at all the things we could possibly do. Knowing that to truly promote fairness in the rental market, we need to work very closely with agencies like HUD and Treasury, but also look beyond that to a broader set of agencies that traditionally were seen as outside of the sphere of housing, but we know very much are intimately tied to the field of housing. With that said, I'm not going to sit here and read out all the actions that we put in the blueprint itself, but there are a couple of kind of key things or themes that I want to pull out. First, were kind of new interagency collaborations that we were particularly excited about. So some of you are on the email distribution list that we've created through our briefing. So you actually got an email earlier today that I hope you all read and we're excited about. But the Federal Trade Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau are working together in unprecedented ways. They released an RFI that I hope you will all check out and comment on. And what that's doing is looking at unfairness in the rental market, particularly on the leasing side, but throughout the whole rental market. And so what they're doing is they're collecting information and data that's going to inform their policy process. So this kind of request for information is critical in the policy development process. And these two agencies working together on this RFI and then also then to explore policy actions from there is very much unprecedented on many levels, and we're very excited about that. We've also acknowledged that, there are other agencies invested in the housing market as well. You saw the Federal Housing Finance Agency is going to be announcing soon a process that they're unfolding to look at ways to advance renter protections in the mortgages that they finance. We also took a deep dive and look into what agencies are currently doing and how they could do things better. Right, so HUD made a commitment, and they're going through a process right now to do proposed rulemaking that would require public housing authorities and owners of project-based rental assistance to provide at least 30 days advance notice before terminating a lease due to non-payment of rent. This is one of the many things that occurred during the pandemic, and what the pandemic showed us is there's many things we can do and we should do, and we are committed to doing those things. Interestingly enough, throughout this process, we learned that the Department of Defense actually has a Bill of Rights for people who live in military housing, right? And what they've done is they've actually doubled down on that, and they're including the right to organize as a part of their Bill of Rights, but also providing expanded services for folks living particularly in off-site housing, for helping them look for affordable housing options. And then another thing, USDA is essentially looking through doing a broad set of actions that will advance clear leases and ensure that tenants can seek compliance with lease terms without fear of retaliation. So those are just a few items, right? So kind of spanning across new agencies, creating more interagency collaboration, acknowledging that the agency is doing great work already, could look at what they're doing and think about how to do it better, but also acknowledging that there's a critical role for Congress to play in supporting all these efforts. So excited to be here today because while we launched the blueprint in January now, right, which feels like forever ago, but yesterday at the same time, we are committed to what we put in that blueprint, but also acknowledging that the idea generation does not stop there, right? There's a broad set of actions that we can still be considering that you might propose very much here today. So we're really excited to hear your thoughts and have this be an ongoing conversation. So with that said, thank you, and I'll turn to my colleague.
Thank you, Vincent. My name's Chang Chu. I am a special policy advisor in HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. We commonly just call it the Civil Rights Office at HUD. To put it in plain person speak. And it's an honor to be here today to speak to you all about some of the actions in the Tenant Protection Blueprint that HUD has committed to. You'll be seeing several folks from HUD in the coming days, including my boss, Dimitri McCain, the head of the Civil Rights Office at HUD, and then the ultimate boss, Secretary Fudge, I understand is doing a fireside chat with you all on Wednesday. And so you may hear from her on some of the things I'm going to be telling you. So just is a sneak preview, and you can get some of your questions ready for her. Hopefully, it's a little preparation. Putting that aside, so let me start by saying FHEO is one office of many at HUD, and it was all the offices together that came together in this interagency process that Vincent helped lead to put up HUD's commitments to the blueprint. So I also say that in saying that I know a lot about what FHEO has put into the blueprint, and I know a little bit about what the rest of the offices of HUD have put in. So I will do my best to tell you about them, but I may need to take a lot of questions back if you do have some specific questions on them. Tenant protection and eviction prevention, it's very important to Secretary Fudge, and she's made it a big priority of hers since the beginning of the administration. We've been really proud with the help of the White House and with the help of our friends on the Hill to have expanded by 100,000 vouchers through the last several budgets and with the legislation in the American Rescue Plan. HUD is also really proud that we have the most actions of any agency that participated in this whole government process to create the blueprint. And our actions vary from new rulemaking, like the one Vincent pointed out about the 30-day notice, to best practices and technical assistance. And I'm going to go into a little more detail about that. But we're also looking for ways for the secretary to use her bully pulpit and stature to nudge the private market as well. Many of you know that HUD acknowledges that we have mostly control over the HUD-assisted housing stock. So that's 4 to 5 million units in this country, 10% of the housing market. And what we can do on the private market side is through fair housing tools and nudging private landlords and corporations that own private housing to do better and to commit to what HUD is trying to do with its own rules and regulations. But even that being said, we at HUD acknowledge that for the households that live in HUD-assisted units, although the regulations on paper give them more protection than the private market, we know in practice that what's happening in practice is not living up to the promises on paper. And we know we have more work to do, and we acknowledge that. And you, through your work, are helping HUD and the rest of the government see where we have weaknesses in our regulations, where we can improve. And we love that partnership, and we welcome that partnership. So we issued the blueprint with the White House in January, and now the hard work of implementing what's in the blueprint has commenced. And so there are many HUD teams in conversations about that. And what I'd like to do is highlight 8 of the actions that HUD committed to in the blueprint. Vincent's talked about one of them, which is the 30-day notice. So I won't go into too much detail about that. But let me just tick these down one by one, and if you have questions about them, I'm happy to take them during this session. So the first is releasing best practices on the use of tenant screening reports. As you all know, tenant screening is used in HUD-assisted housing, but it's also used in the private market. So this is something that applies to the entire housing market. These best practices that HUD will create would include the importance of communicating clearly to tenants when information obtained during a tenant background check is used to make an adverse determination against a tenant. And the best practices would include providing tenants the opportunity to address inaccurate information contained within background screening reports. There would be some coordination HUD would have to do with other agencies like CFPB and FTC because they have other authorities that we don't have. But we think getting these best practices out there is very important. Another commitment from HUD is releasing guidance addressing the use of tenant screening algorithms in ways that may violate the Fair Housing Act. As many of you know, housing providers are more and more relying on the services of third-party tenant screening companies to run checks. It may be background checks on credit reports. It may be background checks on involvement with the justice system. And housing providers have been depending on that information for making decisions on whether to admit people into their housing. One of the problems is a lot of the tenant screening companies are not very open about what goes into that algorithm or artificial intelligence that they're using. And one of the specific questions has come up is whether or not those tenant screening companies, the actions by those companies, are covered by the Fair Housing Act. We're exploring guidance that will clear up the liability that tenant screening companies have under the Fair Housing Act. There's been some private litigation that's currently out there right now, and we hope this guidance can be clarifying. Another HUD commitment. We will explore opportunities to address source of income discrimination through guidance. I mentioned earlier, we're really proud of 100,000 vouchers that are available so far in this administration. We know the use of those vouchers and the effectiveness of those vouchers relies on combating source of income discrimination. Those vouchers are not going to be as effective if housing providers continually turn people away because they say they don't want to take vouchers. So one thing that HUD is exploring is clarifying guidance on the relationship between the Fair Housing Act and sources of income discrimination. This is really important too. The other commitment I'll highlight is notice a funding opportunity for our Office of Multifamily Housing to fund tenant education and outreach. I'm limited in what I can say about this award opportunity because this NOFO, as we call it, will hit the streets at some time, and there'll be a lot more information about what is entailed in it at that time. But in general, I can say that this NOFO will support tenant capacity building in multifamily properties. So please keep your eye out for that. Another commitment that HUD has made relates to accessibility for people with disabilities. And this is what we call an advance notice of proposed rulemaking for our Section 504 regulations. This is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Some of you may know we have not issued an update to these regulations, the Section 504 regulations, since 1988. That is far too long, and we live in a different time today. So what will be coming out from HUD, hopefully in a few weeks, is a list of questions, basically a request for information, but we're calling it a ANPRM, that will ask for public input on how we can improve our 504 regulations. So anything from new percentages on the number of units that are accessible in HUD-assisted housing to different design standards. And there's much more than that as well. But we encourage you to pay attention to that when it is released. Another commitment relates to inspections. So inspections of HUD-assisted housing. Our Office of Public and Indian Housing will be announcing the launch of something called NSPIRE. So that's an acronym, and it stands for the National Standards for the Physical Inspection of Real Estate. So what this NSPIRE standards will do is create one unified, uniform standard for all HUD-assisted housing, no matter whether it's in a public housing agency or whether it's in the private market using housing choice vouchers. We want to bring clarity to the market so that we have one safe, consistent standard. And that standard will focus on units. It will focus on deficiencies and hazards that are most consequential for residents in their units and in their homes. And we hope this will create a nationwide movement for better standards for people living in HUD-assisted housing. Our Office of Public and Indian Housing will be making an announcement about this shortly. Also encourage you to pay attention to that. Just a couple more. Another important commitment relates to the Violence Against Women's Act. So HUD will be implementing, we already are implementing, the VAWA Housing Protections and Enforcement Authorities. Last year, Congress and the president reauthorized VAWA as legislation, and contained in that reauthorization were clearer and stronger safeguards for survivors of domestic violence. As of now, my office at HUD, FHEO, is enforcing VAWA. We are taking in complaints for people who feel like they should be getting VAWA protections but aren't getting them through the HUD-assisted housing that they're living in. And just to give you a couple examples, the list is quite long, and we encourage you to go to our website, hud.gov/VAWA. But folks cannot be denied admission to HUD-subsidized units because of domestic violence committed against them. They also can't be evicted from a subsidized unit because of domestic violence committed against them. And there are other categories as well, which I won't go into detail right now. But that's a very significant commitment by HUD. And finally, for the tenant protection blueprint, we announced in the blueprint that HUD would be awarding $20 million in the eviction protection grant program in this fiscal year, so fiscal year 23. So this is on top of $40 million that has already been awarded by HUD. This is funding 21 grantees in 19 states to provide legal assistance to thousands of households. And in the new budget that was just announced last week, fiscal year 24 contains $10 million of additional funding for this program. I'm going to conclude by mentioning a recent announcement that Secretary Fudge made earlier in the month. And it doesn't directly relate to tenant protections or the blueprint, but it relates instead to another initiative of the White House, which is junk fees. And some of you may have heard about this, and I'm sure she'll bring it up on Wednesday. Junk fees. Yeah, I'm gonna explain what this is. Fees. F-E-E-S. So, I apologize, I wasn't clear. So the president has urged federal agencies to do everything they can do to crack down on these junk fees across the economy. And the president's called for this in the banking sector, to cable and internet bills, airline and concert tickets. And HUD has been looking at this issue as it relates to application fees and other things that are charged by housing providers that are not very clear. So the secretary believes that every renter should know the true costs of finding a home and staying in their home. And she believes that fees charged to renters should be fair and transparent. So many renters today face fees that are hidden, duplicative, or unnecessary as part of the housing search and leasing process. These fees limit options for renters and strain household budgets, particularly for renters with low and modest incomes who already face high rental cost burdens. So the secretary, through a letter that she issued on March 7th, earlier this month, is encouraging all rental housing providers, as well as the companies that provide leasing and property management services to providers and rental platforms, to adopt policies that promote fairness and transparency for renters. And these include eliminating rental application fees, or limiting application fees to only those necessary to cover actual and legitimate costs for services, allowing a single application fee to cover multiple applications on the same platform or across multiple properties owned by one housing provider or managed by one company across providers, eliminating duplicative, excessive, and undisclosed fees at all stages of the leasing process, such as administrative fees and other processing fees, in addition to rental application fees, and clearly identifying bottom line amounts that tenants will pay for move-in and monthly rent-in advertisements of rental property and in-lease documents, including all recurring monthly costs and their purpose. So the secretary is using her bully pulpit on this issue. We will explore ways where we can improve this. But she'll say more on this, I'm sure, on Wednesday. But I wanted you to hear it in this space as well. So I'll stop there. happy to take questions along with it.
I'm just going to piggyback on that. So that actually was a part of the blueprint work as well. And so in it, they actually reference the blueprint. And one of the key parts is like, one of the things we're trying to do is kind of acknowledge the interconnectedness of all these things, right? And so it's not just an application fee, right? The idea of an adverse action notice is owner telling you why you were not able to access a unit, right? Why you were rejected from the unit. So it's not just enough to say you didn't get the unit, it's to let someone know why they didn't get the unit, right? And the best practices that Chang mentioned, that their HUD's going to be working with CFPB, FTC, USDA, FHFA, all 5 agencies combined, right, putting out guidance around best practices is really important, particularly in the junk fees context, because you could pay a high application fee once, and if you don't know why you got rejected, you could pay the same application fee over and over and over and over, and that's the epitome of a junk fee, right? And there might be something that's in the screening report that is something you could actually fix. It might actually be something that's not even you, right? I don't know how many of you have ever looked at some of your credit reports, but I learned recently why I was getting stuff from the AARP, right? It's because somehow my dad's credit is intertwined with mine at one point. And, you know, I'm not quite there yet. Soon I'll be there. Not too long off. But that said, I was like, they're a little eager here. Why am I getting stuff from AARP? But the reality is I would never have known that, right, had I not actually went to go purchase a home and saw my full credit report for the first time and was like, that's not me, right? And so lo and behold, there's a lot of folks who might have stuff on their credit report that they might not even know is on there, that they're getting rejected for from a rental unit over and over and over and paying this application fee over and over and over for. And that's something you could correct, right? It limits your housing access, but it also exposes you to more costs along the way. So all to say is, you know, the nice part here is we're really trying to thread these narratives in important ways, right? Across multiple actions, across the administration and across agencies to look at the continuum, right? It's not just finding the unit, it's staying in the unit, right? It's looking for other units. And so really trying to kind of draw those bridges or build those bridges. So sorry to tack on to you.
No, that's important. That's important. Thank you. Cool. Should we take questions?
And then online questions. I'll hold it for you. I got it.
All right, thank you. A concern that I have is something that should be implemented as part of the regulation in addition to junk fees. When an HCV tenant applies for an apartment, there should be a date and stamp at the time of the application while the housing authority is processing the application. Because if not, somebody will come along who's not an assisted tenant, and they would rather deal with the cash person, and they will accept the person's cash and give them the unit, whereby the Section 8 person hasn't been processed. So if we put a measure in place, a regulation in place, as soon as a Section 8 application applies for a unit, that it be dated and stamped and a receipt sent to the proposed tenant and the housing authority. And that way the tenant is protected.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Your comment? I'll take this back to my Office of Public and Indian Housing colleagues who administer the PHA programs to see what guidance they have on it. But just so I understand what you're suggesting, the date and stamp for the application would be useful because then applications would be taken in the order that
Exactly. Yeah. While the housing authority is processing it, and some housing authorities are very quick and some are very slow. Mm-hmm. And the landlord wants to rent that apartment. So you haven't been vetted yet, but somebody comes along after you and they got cash, they're going to, more than likely, the landlord's going to take that person with cash. So we need to protect the Section 8 tenant until they're rejected.
And that's something either the Inspire inspection stuff helps with a bit. Doesn't solve your problem
No, it does
completely,
not.
right? But
It
it's
does
one of
not
the
solve-
many parts that causes that lag, like you're saying, right? Is because it has to be processed, there has to be an
Exactly.
inspection, right? Yep.
Exactly, and in the interim, they've already collected your application fee, but they haven't processed your application, then they give it to the person who's paying cash, and for you to look at another apartment, you're gonna have to pay the application fee again. That's not right. So it has to be changed. So just a stroke of a pen, the new FUD regulation. FUD's new rule. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take an online question from Shalonda.
Yes, hi. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, but definitely good seeing you all again. I met you all at the conference, at the Housing Justice League conference, but I guess my question is, when a renter or a tenant or applicant apply for an apartment, and they say, well, they ask you a question, have you received any evictions? Now, an eviction, just because an eviction was filed, it doesn't mean that that eviction is a judgment or it was ruled by a judge or a jury. So that is my concern, is that just because an eviction was filed, it doesn't necessarily mean that there was a judgment. So in applying for apartments, how come the federal government or the White House, it should be a federal rule that any like retaliation evictions, like for myself, that was filed, it should not be a strike against you. It should be expunged by the federal government. It should be able to be removed when you're speaking about credit. So that's all that comes along with the fair housing. It comes along with all the other aspects that you all were speaking about, being fair in the market. So I think that is something that definitely needs to be addressed, and it is a major concern, because time and time again it happened to me, and over and over again. So just wanted to flag that and say that that is a question and a concern of mine for tenants out here and advocates that have retaliatory strikes against them. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalonda. I have some thoughts, but you want so a couple things. First, thank you, Shalonda, and also actually, I think after that event, someone shared your contact information with me, and I added you to our mailing list. So hopefully, you're on the contact list. If not, let me know. So that said. So there's a couple of really important points here. First is, again, using the bully pulpit, right, where we have authorities as kind of the federal agencies, administrative authorities to do things. One of the things we did in the blueprint is very much speak to this point, right, and talk about the sealing of eviction records and things along those lines. There's two unfortunate realities for us, right, which is that we're constrained in our policymaking, which I know is not like a wonderful thing to be saying from a podium, particularly from the White House, right? But that said, there's to really get to the core of what you're pointing to there are kind of two key actors, right? One is Congress clearly kind of passing legislation that makes that a reality, right? But then the second is state and local action, right? So one of the things we really leaned into in the blueprint is acknowledging that many of renter protections actually sit at the state and local level, right? So one of the things we did before we released the blueprint is we did a convening and a briefing for all the Democratic state AGs. The day of the release of the blueprint, AG James of New York released a statement kind of highlighting work that her and some of her colleagues are doing at the statewide level to advance enforcement efforts. But that said, the other thing we've been doing is a lot of outreach to state and local policymakers. We did a whole briefing to state lawmakers and have some ongoing work through our Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, kind of highlighting best practices in this area to try to get state law and local law that would really advance the kind of protections you're talking about there. So I know that's not a very satisfying response. The reality is one of the things we really had to understand or kind of lean into with the blueprint was our constraints of what we could do with administrative authority, and acknowledge beyond that we have a platform for saying what we believe is good policy, right? And so we use the blueprint itself and also the way we're engaging state and local actors as well as Congress to try to kind of move forward with some of the broader ideas that sit outside of that, like that idea that was just put forward.
In-person question?
So I had a question. So first of all, thank you for the blueprint, hearing our demands that we made and implementing them to policy. But there's some things missing around Section 3 enforcement, right? That we feel that FHEO could be doing. A lot of evictions are economically motivated, and these evictions are due to the lack of economic participation, be it Section 8 or public housing residents who own businesses that could participate. The other one is a recommendation that we would make. I would love for you guys to bring back regional field hearings so you can hear from more people in a regional manner and just hear all their complaints. And then the last recommendation would be, when would you institute a moratorium on Section 8 vouchers expiring due to the current market of folks not renting in Section 8? I've been organizing with tenants and residents who have experienced some of the worst stressful moments in their life as they get towards that deadline of their Section 8 expiring. So maybe a moratorium around that would assist Section 8 potential clients.
I can bring that back to my colleagues on the Section 8 moratoriums. I did have a question about what.
Oh, like so in Chicago, I don't know if this nationwide, but in Chicago, it's nationwide. Section 8 voucher holders who get their name called on the list get X amount of time and an X amount of extension. That's right. Post-COVID, landlords have been adamant about not renting to low-income people because they felt like they exploited the eviction moratorium during COVID. This is well known. Yeah. We need a moratorium to protect these vouchers because we can have 100,000 vouchers out there, right? Mm-hmm. But if 90,000 of them can't find a unit because of the fees and all these other things, we're getting nowhere. So that's why we need a moratorium on the expiration of Section 8 and housing choice vouchers.
You began by saying Section 3 enforcement. Can you elaborate on that? So
Section 3 is a 1968 rule that allows for residents of Section 8 public housing, low-income housing, to participate in any HUD-funded project. Over the last 20 years, we've seen the lack of enforcement for that, particularly in my neighborhood of Cabrini Green. BGA did an investigation that showed we was promised 2,500 jobs over 20 years. We got 40. When you do the math of 2,460 jobs not given times $50,000 entry level in construction, you come up with $123 million that we did not participate in jobs, and almost $180 million in contracting opportunity missed by low-income folks.
Yeah. Okay. And then you tie it to, therefore, folks. You
can tie it to anything. If I'm not economically participating in contracting and redeveloping my community, then there's no way to prevent me from selling drugs, doing shootings. Mm-hmm. We always say providing economic alternative to criminal elements. Peace, right? Give a man a job, he's less likely to rob.
Thank you.
Online question? We're rotating between in-person and online questions.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. I'm Laura Ramos. I'm with Everyone for Accessible Community Housing Roles in New Jersey, and I have two main points. One is regarding the Inspire. You have to look at the buildings as well as the units. Far too many buildings are constructed wrong, like our last place we lived where the water was coming under the building and causing mold and all kinds of things to happen inside the building. But you wouldn't necessarily see it because there was the foundation that was eroding rather than the inside of the apartment. really has to be looked at, because across the country there are millions of buildings that are deteriorating from the outside and causing problems inside that are not necessarily completely visible. And then, as a woman with disabilities who needs fully accessible housing, I would like to say the tenant protections fall short when you look at the availability of housing. The federal definition of accessibility hasn't been changed in decades. There was a slight change with the ADA, but that doesn't totally affect residential housing. And one of the biggest things is there's all these different ways that builders and developers and housing authorities can get around providing fully accessible units. The new unit we moved into was supposed to be accessible, but unfortunately, what it means under the federal law and many of the state laws is it means you can roll from the parking lot to the front door, get through the front door, get through the other doors in the apartment, and have room in the bathroom and the kitchen to turn around in your wheelchair. It doesn't mean you can use anything else in the apartment. That has got to change, because the other part, when you look at fair housing and you look at tenant protections, if you can't find an apartment that you can actually use, and you find one that's adaptable, you have to pay to put in the features that you need, which we're all low income, disabled, or elderly people who don't have money for that. And the states and the localities are not using the state affordable housing trust funds, the CDBG funds, the local affordable housing trust funds, not using any of the monies to pay for those accessibility features after the buildings are built. And then a caveat from the original Fair Housing Act, which should be removed and was done when there were far fewer people in the United States population who needed accessible housing, is that the landlord at their whim can tell you you have to pay to remove it. It's almost impossible to find the money that you need from any source to put the accessibility features in, and no one will pay to remove it. It's a physical and financial barrier that needs to be removed, both from for rent housing and from housing for sale. Because there's literally no housing that's being built with any federal funds or other funds that is fully wheelchair accessible or otherwise accessible for those with disabilities in the country.
Thank you for the important comments you made. I'd encourage you to definitely look at the advance notice of proposed rulemaking on Section 504 when it comes out. The questions in that ANPRM will give you the opportunity to make the exact type of feedback that you just provided, and HUD will take that into consideration for the future regulations that we make.
And that's important, right? Because we hear you here, but that's public record, right? So that's like a really important documentation of the facts you're talking about as well. So just to reiterate, with all of these commenting periods, like it's nice to have sessions like this, we're hearing you, but those are all really important formal documentation points where your input is critical.
Mr. Chang, I'd like to piggyback on something that JR said a few minutes ago. The documentation of the vouchers. Okay, how does the OIG, I was on a call last week with the Office of Inspector General, and they were able to get civil monetary penalties. Why is HUD not able to get these civil monetary penalties when these owners discriminate against tenants that's trying to get into housing? Be done.
Yeah. Well, thank you for plus wanting the comment earlier. FHEO, I'm more familiar with the work that the Fair Housing Office does. When there is a discrimination claim on the basis of a protected class, we are able when we're successful, we're able to get civil monetary penalties and policy changes instituted in voluntary compliance agreements with housing providers. I am personally less familiar with when it's a specific voucher issue with a PHA, how those are handled by our Office of Public and Indian Housing, and I will flag this for them to see what can be done about the issue.
And another question, I heard something about HOTMA, and I'm quite sure you know about that right now, and Inspire. Inspire, I feel, has failed us so far. It's just starting, but Inspire gives the owner the access to self-certify. And I'm against owners self-certifying. I'm going to tell you the reason why. Because the inspector will not be coming out. The owners will be certifying themselves. And when is someone coming out to make sure that this owner is telling the truth? And another question, why is it that HUD allows them to do this to tenants? We asked for a tenant survey in that Inspire. They didn't do anything about it. They said, yes, we will give you a tenant survey. They need to come to the building when they're doing the REACT inspections and have the tenants fill out that survey a couple of months or before they even get there. We asked them to do that. They asked for our input. They took none of our input. So all the information I'm giving you now is that you keep saying, send us the information. We've been giving HUD information for years. Nothing has been done. And Vincent, when I came to the White House back in November, and this is what I'm telling you, it's like stacks and stacks of papers just piling up, and we're sending information, recommendation. Nobody's taking it. Tenant needs to be at the table. They gotta be at the table. Enough of this. I'm finished. That's it.
So can I ask with that too? Because this is an earnest question. So here, to me, this is a table, right? That was a table, right? So we're by virtue of being the federal government, I would say one of the constraints we have, at least at the White House, is that there's actually limitations on repeat engagements with the same groups of tenants through FACA requirements, right? And so one of the things we committed to with the Renter Bill of Rights is essentially a rotating quarterly meetings with renters from different perspectives that different agencies are organizing, right? To try to also make sure we're trying to get kind of as broad of a diverse of perspectives in the policymaking process. So for instance, USDA is going to be leading one, particularly to try to bring in more tenants from rural areas and hear their voices, right? Treasury is helping us organize one, and that's probably going to lean a little more heavily into tax credit housing, and renters live in tax credit housing. HUD has a lot of kind of engagement efforts throughout. So all to say, one of the things we've tried to do with the announcement, right, is acknowledge that it's not just a transaction, right, that you do need kind of these ongoing feedback loops. And so we've set those up as a way to do that, but would love to hear your thoughts beyond that, right? What is acknowledging too that policymaking takes longer sometimes or all the time than we would like. Just hearing here, love to hear your thoughts on ways we could do that more productively.
We have a national group, the National Alliance of HUD Tenants, where tenants are there, and you said, I hear you say you want to hear from a broad perspective of tenants.
Yep.
So we are your organization.
And that's where, that kind of engagement, I imagine you do a fair amount, and my colleague here could speak more about HUD's direct engagement with you all, right? So that's definitely one of the many voices we're trying to bring to the table. I would say, one of the goals of the Renter Bill of Rights is acknowledging the critical role of HUD-assisted tenants, but also acknowledging the rental market being much broader than that as well. And one of the challenges I think we face, and one of the things we tried to push forward in the Renter Bill of Rights, is trying to also figure out the acknowledgement that there's so many segments of the rental market where we want to engage tenant. There's no one tenant, right? There's no one renter. There's no one problem. It takes on different forms. And so that's one of the things we're trying to learn about. So we're hoping with those quarterly meetings, we'll kind of learn about better systems to engage the cross-section, but I hear you here with the NAT point as well.
Collaborating with the National Income Housing Coalition and NAT, we could be your go-to.
Oh, I think they're, sorry, we're deferring to the lady with, right there
Okay,
with the mic.
my name is Joy Johnson, and I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia. So I have two questions. First, I'm a public housing resident. The vouchers, I do want to understand a little bit better about the payment standard. In Charlottesville, the payment standard, the amount of rent that people, they're charging for a one-bedroom, the vouchers doesn't, the payment standard needs to be higher. It needs to be looked at. And so that's one thing, because we have a lot of people who get the voucher, their name come up on the list, get the voucher, but they're told you don't make enough income, or you have to make 3 times the amount of income for the month in order to qualify there, even with a voucher. And sometimes what happened, the landlord jacked the rent up because they know that they can get that payment from the housing authority. So that's one. The second thing that I wanted to ask real quickly, because I'm mindful that other people have it, is how does HOTMA play into all of this when you all are sneakingly moving to work on folks who are living in public housing? You call it over income. And so how is that going to affect, and how does it affect properties such as what we are building in Charlottesville, which have public housing, vouchers, and tax credit? How does those rules, how do they come together? And Faircloth, maybe I saved that for Ms. Fudge, but Faircloth is another hindrance of not bringing back 1-for-1 replacement.
I'll go first. Thank you for your question, Joy. I admit I do not know much about HOTMA because the Fair Housing Office doesn't deal with that program too much, but I will take back your concerns to my colleagues so they are aware. So. I mean, on Faircloth, what I can say is where the Fair Housing Office intersects with RAD conversions is we do front-end reviews, and we can do a better job of them to make sure that commitments that PHAs are saying they will do when they enter into a conversion are lived up to at the back end. But I can also take that one back to my PIH colleagues.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joy.
I'll get a card before you leave.
Hi. Ooh, that was loud. I'm real energetic about this question. So my name is Ramona. That's actually my colonial name. My name that I chose to be called by is Guatuque Ini Inaru. And I'm a descendant of the Taino people who first encountered Columbus in modern-day Dominican Republic. I am a public housing tenant and currently live in New York City in the South Bronx. And I founded Safe Section 9, which is a coalition of organizations that work nationally to rehabilitate and to uphold the promise of public housing, which I feel that this administration is not joining us in. So the question I have for you is, both the legislature, so Congress and Senate, and White Houses for the last 20 years have overlooked the operational funding needs of public housing. And your current budget is only allocating $7.5 billion to address the capital needs of the most distressed public housing properties nationwide. But my neighborhood, NYCHA, alone needs $40 billion. So where will you be finding the money necessary to address this deficit? And I want to note that Human Rights Watch sent a letter both to the White House and to Congress regarding the impact of privatization, because conversion is not the adequate term for what HUD has been doing when they enter project-based Section 8 agreements with the private market. Neighbors helping neighbors also conducted a survey, and all of these are finding that the tenant doesn't win under privatization. So it is obvious that the private market is not the solution to the housing woes of public housing tenants. And we are the only truly affordable housing stock in the United States. That is, if we were to be adequately funded and got the oversight and maybe some new housing authorities, we wouldn't have to talk about voucher discrimination. We wouldn't have to talk about landlords that discriminate against our community. So I'll end by saying that there is no conversation about affordable housing that can happen in the United States without having Section 9 tenants at the table. And I want to give you a definition of what I mean by the table. I think this is an important discourse, and I found the link to add our name to the challenge discussion that you guys are having online. But Section 9 has built-in protections that are not being upheld. So the first step to ensure that we're at that table is to truly audit, maybe with the Department of Justice, how public housing authorities are including or excluding tenants like myself and tenants like the ones that are here today. But again, the core question is, how are you going to fund that deficit that isn't addressed in the current budget, and at the same time claim you're having a conversation on affordable housing?
Thank you for the feedback. I know it's budget creations of budgets are always a difficult challenge, and budgets are a statement of our values, right? So, and I know it can be frustrating to see things that you deeply care about not get the level of funding that you may want. All I can say, because my office did not write up the budget for the PIH admin costs, is I can take this back to them as a concern and feedback on our fiscal year 24 budget. I know Secretary Fudge is doing all she can to make sure that all equities in HUD's different priorities get hashed out and accounted for. And so there are at times trade-offs that have to be made, but I thank you for highlighting that one. I will say, just to talk about AFFH briefly, and Vincent mentioned it in his opening remarks. The AFFH notice of proposed rulemaking is something that is out for public comment right now. So there's not a ton we can say about it because we're in that stage of the regulatory process. But AFFH, if and when it becomes a final rule, it can set up a framework for public housing authorities to be held accountable for their conversions. And they can discuss things like that in assessment of fair housing. And the way that we have created the current proposed rule is there's a robust community engagement mechanism where HUD grantees, like a PHA, and then like the earlier speaker was saying about the trust fund not making commitments and funding for disability issues. AFFH creates the touch point for those criticisms to be analyzed a bit more in a dialogue between local governments, PHAs, and the communities they're supposed to be serving.
Okay, after Ramona's follow-up, we'll have time for one more question, and then I'll pass it to Rebecca Bennett to do the reflection for us. Thank you.
So I just want to add that, the members of our organization, one thing I impose on them is you don't just come with a problem, you need to bring me a solution, because oftentimes tenants have the solutions to these problems. So we have a set of national solutions that have been shared with the entire New York delegation and additional Congress people and stakeholders. So I can definitely share that with you. And in that is some guidance that tenants have developed over the last 3 years. And some of that includes how to hold NYCHA and other housing authorities accountable, even with the possibility of issuing a state of emergency for public housing across the United States. So I can hand those over to whoever you guys want.
My name is Patricia Simpson, and my question is, why was NYCHA, the largest provider of public housing, not included as a partner for the challenge meetings, which should be happening in the spring of this year? My second question is, how can tenants from NYCHA be properly represented in these conversations?
So I think your first question was about the resident centered housing challenge. So we would absolutely welcome NYCHA submitted. So those are kind of self submissions, right? So everyone's invited to be a part of it. So if NYCHA wanted to put something forward within it, they are definitely welcome to, right? And so we've had a kind of a broad set of folks engaging with that, from private developers to advocacy groups to rental platforms to you name it, right? And the goal with that challenge was, again, to kind of push the field to show ways they would align with the blueprint itself. So fully welcome NYCHA engaging with it, and would welcome a submission from them showing how they're bringing more to the table. And one example could be through advanced resident engagement, like you're saying, right? And so the right to organize was one of the pillars of the Blueprint for Renters' Rights. We have some funding opportunities that are going to be coming out to support some organizing capacity, right? We have some agencies that committed to advancing organizing as a part of their work. But that said, through the challenge as well, one of the things that we've I think actually even one of our earlier commitments was about organizing as well.
Question was, how can tenants from NYCHA be properly represented?
In which capacity? So I guess there's, in what's that?
In these conversations, how can we be represented, properly represented in these conversations?
So I would say I guess there are several conversations, right? One is the ones that HUD is having, what housing authorities are having about their decisions, right? Another that HUD's having on the policymaking space, another that we're having at the kind of White House level to understand cross-agency work. So across the cross-agency work, one of the things we're doing is working with broad sets of stakeholders, right? And so, the National Association of HUD Tenants came to a couple of meetings already, looking forward to very much engaging with them. I don't know if NYCHA residents are a part of that at all. No. What's that? NAT's only. So we also have one of the major public housing tenant organizations as well. I'm forgetting their name off the top of my head. But within that, we engage actually the National Low Income Housing Coalition a fair amount in this work. And so can definitely chat with them about ways to make sure we're broadening the groups that we're engaging with through those quarterly meetings. I would say beyond that, though, there's a separate mechanism of what are housing authorities themselves doing to engage you, and then separately what HUD's doing, right, to engage you in conversations that they're having with housing authorities. So I don't really know if you can speak to the HUD side of things at all. Yeah,
Briefly, we have a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Engagement, and her name is Ruth Jones-Nichols. She's been with us for about a year, and she's really been reforming how we do public engagement, and that includes meetings with organizations that normally would not have a voice with HUD. Ruth Jones-Nichols, and I'm happy to introduce you to her.
And with the is anyone here a part of the Housing Justice Network? I imagine a lot of folks are, right? So I know you coordinate, there's routine calls, right, that Ruth organizes with HUD. And that becomes actually a really important venue for both translating what's going on in the policymaking space, but actually hearing questions as well. And so I know when we rolled out our blueprint for renters' rights, we engaged Ruth. She worked with the Housing Justice Network. So how often are those meetings? They're quarterly as well? So those are separate quarterly meetings happen. So that would actually be, I think, a really important thing. And I'm sure one of the things we can do is make sure that I think through even LHC, since they have all your contact information, I don't think they can freely give it to us, but maybe if you can signal to them, I think that becomes an easy way for us ensuring that those quarterly meetings with the Housing Justice Network are capturing or including as many folks as possible.
This is our last question.
Hello, my name is Beverly McFarland. I'm a resident leader in New York City in Taft Houses. My question is, first of all, Section 9 is true affordable housing under Section 9. Section 8, TPV vouchers are negative impacts in our communities. There is not, when you do private partnerships, I don't understand why public money is going to private developers. And why are y'all doing that? Because it's negatively impacting. These TPV vouchers that y'all giving to NYCHA is asking for 25,000 TPV vouchers. Y'all saying that's for the nation. And they asking, and they got it through legislation that they getting they asking HUD for 25,000 vouchers under TPV. And under the TPV vouchers is Section 18, which is demolishment, in that clause. After that clause, and at that clause, who's to say that we would not be another Cabrini Green if they find that the rehabilitation act is too costly, and then they'll just demolish our buildings? Is that what they want to do? Then, in fact, they're sitting up here saying that they're going to ask HUD to get their inspections waived. We plead with you not to waive NYCHA's TPV vouchers at all. Not only not to waive it, but not to give them the whole 25,000 vouchers that they're asking for. And when you go to the inspections, make sure y'all come to inspection, because our homes just need to be rehabilitated, not demolished. Our homes, if this is where we live, and we love where we live, this is a disinvestment for years and years of disinvestment. And they've been cheating and lying and taking these money and inflatable charges on rehabbing departments. But what I do want to say also, y'all need to look into how can NYCHA also have an active consent decree and go into a trust, taking 25,000 apartments away from our of the housing roll. So that should be illegal. It should be illegal for them, and even in your 964 regs, it's saying you should not be going into any kind of housing act unless with an active consent decree. So they have not fulfilled the consent decree. So that should be looked into.
Beverly, thank you for the information. I've taken notes, and I will bring it back to my folks.
RED conversions does not work for our community in New York City. RED impact does not work for our communities. It's a high number of evictions and unlawful convictions. So we have to know that private partnership does not work for New York City.
Thank you so much. Let us give a round of applause one last time for Vincent Reyna and Cheng Chu. They have homework, right? We have given plenty of homework, and we'll be leaning heavily on our NLIHC staff and leaders to help follow through, right, on the commitments for follow-up and engagement that can certainly be help be facilitated by the coalition. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And don't forget to submit your public comments, please. There's the RFI from CFPB and FTC, right? There's the AFFH. So, Diane, you're right there. I know you have every link for all the public commenting. And it sounds like there's some more kind of proposed HUD rulemaking coming up around housing quality. So those are really, really critical venues. So again, really appreciate everyone's time and energy and feedback here today. But we really encourage you also to not let this come at the cost of actually submitting the comments there as well, because those are really critical moments for the policymaking space and honestly help us make the case internally within the government also for a lot of the stuff that you're saying here today. So.
All right. Thank you so much.
So much.